I built a new workbench for the shop, and for a long time I'd been using this old flimsy interior door as a bench. It's just not cutting it anymore. So I finally decided it's time to build a real workbench for the shop. On top, I have a different project going, making a desk for Tori, cutting board for the boat, made out of strips of firewood. I'll probably do some kind of video on both of those later. This one is just the process I went through in making this bench. I grabbed 36 2x4s from Lowe's and I ran them through the planer on the face sides to get rid of all those lumberyard imperfections. You've got to get the surfaces good and clean for better gluing together. I glued 7 or 8 at a time together into beams so that they wouldn't be too wide to fit through my planer. Each side of the table I cut clamp gaps for the underside, and that will make a lot more sense when you see the table put together. Once the beams were all glued together, I ran them through the planer. Probably the biggest challenge in this build is to get a good, flat, even, smooth surface on the tabletop. So to get that smooth tabletop, when I glued the beams together, I used a couple of chamfered 2x4s to assure the seams of each of the beams were flush, and it worked out quite well. The legs are built with double 2x4s, glued and screwed together. The outer 2x4s are inset into the bench. One end of the bench has more overhang than the other because, I don't know, maybe it'll come in handy for something. Plus the legs won't get in the way of the vise when I install it. And I threw in just standard bracing for stability. Here's a look at the bottom of the table before flipping it over. And those clamp gaps are there for clamping things to the side of the table with standard hand clamps. I have one every foot, and you can also see the recesses for the legs. Dog holes are next. I used scrap wood to build a guide so I could get good vertical holes using my hand drill, and also to get consistent distances from the edge of the table to the holes. I put in 2 rows of 3/4 inch dog holes down the side that will have the vise, and 1 row down the other side of the table, all of them a foot between the holes. I made a few risers to peg into the dog holes for things like sawing and gluing. The first use of the risers was for sawing a piece of plywood to make the shelf that goes underneath the table. I did some sanding until the vise arrived in the mail, and that was easy enough to install with a few screws and some leg bolts underneath. Then I installed a couple blocks of wood inside the vise with 2 more dog holes on the drive side. Last, I laid down some teak oil, mostly because that's what I happen to have laying around. And that works fine. It gives just a slightly oiled surface on the bench that makes things like glue and epoxy scrape up a lot easier. All in, the materials for this bench cost $210. $145 for all of the lumber and the glue, about 1/3 of a gallon of glue, and $65 for the vise. Final measurements, it's 37 inches high, 40 inches wide, and 94 inches long, and it weighs 330 pounds.